Hello, everybody. Welcome. We just want to extend a huge welcome to Maddie's for inviting us into their home today and hosting this webinar, the entire series, in fact. Our discussion today is Dr. Kate Hurley and Dr. Cynthia Karsten from the Correct Shelter Medicine Program and the MMPC. Woo, woo, here to present the final webcast in the series, Right Outcomes. Doctors, take it away.
All right. Well, welcome everybody. I always say it's my favorite, but this really feels good to send them to the best possible outcome and on with their little animal lives. I'm going to start right out with a polling question. All right. So where have you gotten the pets in your whole life? And you can choose obviously as many as apply. All right. So pretty good mix of sources. Shelter rescue, almost everybody, but interestingly, not everybody on this call has gotten a pet from a shelter or a rescue. And quite a few, more than half, have gotten one from a friend or a neighbor. Stray or found, breeder, and pet store, still 35%, 25%. And a stranger just walked up to you on the street and gave you a pet. So just the point that we all have gotten pets from lots of different sources, and there are lots of sources available from which people can get pets. And interesting, though, that 88% of us have gotten a pet from a shelter or rescue. And so we are a group of people who have a lot of access to that as a source of pets. Now we're going to ask another question. Who amongst us has ever lost a pet and not found it? Have you ever lost a pet and not been reunited? I will say I have. It's when I was 10, it's my first cat. And I still think about her, even though she would now be 51 years old. So if you've ever lost a pet and not been reunited, how many people here have had that experience? And if you did lose a pet, did you get a new pet within a year? I did. That was my pet that I got from a stranger down the street from me. Just sort of have thoughts on like, how was that? What happened? Do you still think about that pet? How old were you when that happened? I think that's something that we're really just trying to come to grips with now as a profession, is what is the experience of people who lose pets? What do they know about how to look for their pets? And how can we increase the odds that people will be reunited with their pet? One, because there's a lot of sadness when you lose a pet and you never know what happened with that animal. Two, because we know that a good percentage of the time, when people lose a pet, they don't just sort of throw up their hands and say, oh, well, I guess I just won't have a pet now. But they replace that pet. And so when we bring an animal into the shelter and it doesn't get reunited with its owner, not only do we have to then find a home for that animal, but also very often that pet will be replaced, and often from another source than a shelter, if that was someone who wasn't able to get to the shelter to reunite their pet. So I'm just looking in the chat, and just the comments are so poignant, heartbroken, shameful, constant worry, heartbreaking, devastating. Had a cat stolen. That was very traumatic as well. So these are losses that really, they stick with us for a long time. And sometimes it's not like the grown up in the family. Like, at least in my case, I wasn't the one in charge of dealing with like how we would go about looking for my cat. I really didn't know. I didn't have a car, I didn't have money. And it was really up to my mom to do all of that. And yet I'm the one who really, I cried myself to sleep every night for 6 months. In a way, it is a privilege. I didn't think I'd get verklempt on this slide, but God, when I started, anything but euthanasia. We were so desperate We were under so much pressure. We had so few tools to be able to get an animal out alive any which way was such a huge win. And it still is, right? For a healthy animal that's not a menace to society, the right outcome, a live outcome instead of euthanasia, that is so profound. It's such a triumph, and not to take anything away from that, even if it means you got to put it on a plane and send it 2,000 miles away. Do it, if that's the way that animal can be alive and safe and in a home where it's loved. But now we actually get to have more choices. We get to sort of pick and choose among right outcomes for the very rightest outcome that we can provide. And we can think about the animal, the people that love that animal, and the whole system that animal exists in. We can think about ways that we can honor the connection between humans and pets. Try and reduce those times where there's someone left worrying and wondering what happened to their pet, even decades later. That really maintains public health and safety, that increases the education and success that we have in our own communities for people to be successful pet guardians, for pets to succeed in families. And that stabilizes systems. Because all other things being equal, stabilizing the system is the biggest win, because it puts the conditions in place for another animal not to have to come into the system. And it gets us off the hamster wheel of bringing animals in and finding them homes, and then bringing some more animals in and then finding them homes, and bringing more in and finding them homes, and turns that around so that animals are stabilized where they are. So these are a couple of basic truths that were shown in our poll questions, right? Even amongst us, people who want pets will most likely get a pet from somewhere. And people who lose pets and aren't reunited will often replace that pet from somewhere. And so if we put barriers to people getting their pets back or getting a pet from us, we do not decide whether they get pets or whether they have pets. We only get to decide how that happens, where that happens, what the experience is like. So we have talked a lot about vacuum effect, and there's a good reason for it, right? Because vacuum effect underlies why shelters struggled with community cats for so long, until we started putting cats back where they already had a home. Just more and more and more cats came in every year. And when we started putting them back where their home was, it turned it around to an extraordinary extent. So really came to appreciate, I'd heard about vacuum effect and I sort of knew about it in my head, but I appreciated it 3.8 million times over through the Million Cat Challenge. But I think in some ways, thinking about liquid dynamics might be a more useful model than vacuum effect. Because when we talk about vacuum effect, well, we create a vacuum and then it gets filled from somewhere. But where does it get filled from? So look at this gorgeous lake. This is up in Alaska somewhere. Karsten recognized it from her time up there. And if we take a big old bucket of water out of this lake and pour it into another lake somewhere else, what's going to happen? It'll fill back up, right? It'll fill back up so that inflow and outflow are back in balance again. But it won't necessarily, where will it fill from? It'll fill from the uphill side into the downhill side, right? So we take a big bucket out of this lake and we toss it to this uphill side. It's just going to fill back up from this uphill side. It's going to flow in the direction of least resistance. Could flow from the other direction if we create less resistance on the left side instead of the right side. Does that make sense? So we want to think about being careful of supporting unidirectional flow, where we are removing animals from one side, sending them out the other side, only to have them be replaced from the source where we just remove them, because that does not stabilize systems. Hope this is making sense. You can type into the chat a big like, what, if it's not, and I'll see it. So from that perspective, from a system stabilizing perspective, good, live outcome for animals that are not dangerous or irremediably suffering. And this is so important to say, because this is something that I think we have done in the past. Don't let perfect get in the way of good, right? Don't hold out for that vision of a home that's like so perfect and so, exactly what you imagine should be the right home, when you got something good and that's a live outcome and it's going to potentially reduce the length of stay, spare the animal from euthanasia, lower disease rate. Do not let perfect get in the way of good. But also, don't settle for good when you could have better, especially in the medium and the long run. Let's look at how we can turn good into better and best. Because a live outcome back into the same community the animal came from also stabilizes communities, right? It also undoes that vacuum effect or that unidirectional flow system. And the more precise we can be about returning animals alive into the same community, neighborhood, block, home that they came from, the more powerful the effect of eliminating the vacuum and building positive connections between communities who have been historically marginalized and more at risk of struggling with their pets, and the shelter system that it can help support them and their animals in being successful. So best live outcome back into the same home the animal came from, as long as they want it back, because that has the double benefit of stabilizing systems and reuniting families. So I want to get into a little bit more of what we're dealing with in the United States. At a national level, even though our most vulnerable communities only make up about 29% of the US population, look at that, they account for nearly 40% of the total intake, so very disproportionate number of animals coming in from our most marginalized, most excluded, most vulnerable communities. Whereas from our least vulnerable communities, only a quarter of the animals are coming in from our wealthiest quartile of communities. So already we have unidirectional flow from marginalized into privileged, out from marginalized into privileged. That's a problem from a system stabilizing perspective. And this is the percent of animals that come into shelters that go back out into the same community of origin. This is at a sort of national level. So back into the community of origin is return to owner or adoption. Not into the community of origin is transfer or euthanasia. That's how I aggregated those two. This to show that the vast majority of animals that go into our least vulnerable, our most privileged communities, go back in. Right? We solve the vacuum, just like we take the bucket out of the lake, we put the bucket of water right back into the lake, there's no flow. But for our most vulnerable communities, nearly half of the animals that come in don't go back out into those same communities. And that's, social vulnerability obviously is a lot more precise than that. So this is like sort of on a large scale. And if we look more specifically that's sort of at a national scale, at a community view, this is specifically puppy intake and adoption by social vulnerability index, some recent work that was done. And this is, again, the most privileged communities account for a fraction of puppies in and the majority of puppies adopted. Our most vulnerable communities are the source of most of the puppies coming in and account for a minority of the puppies being adopted. And same with kittens, even more dramatically. And so what we have is unidirectional flow, right? We're removing animals from our most vulnerable, our marginalized communities. We're placing them in our most privileged communities. And that is way better than euthanizing those animals or having those animals suffer. So when that's a service for those animals and for those communities, that is something that we should continue to do. But we should recognize it's a treadmill that we will never be able to leave until we can stabilize that balance so that animals are flowing back into those communities, hopefully spayed and neutered and vaccinated with identification and with some support at the same rate that they're coming in, so we can get off of that treadmill. And I know a lot of you have seen these slides in one form or another, but this is just such a striking imbalance. This is where people get pets, according to the AVMA, and this is very similar to data from the American Pet Products Manufacturers Association. These two graphs on the left, dog source and cat source, and the yellow here is rescue or shelter. So about 30% or more of pets obtained from a rescue or a shelter. This is Pet Source in Pets for Life household. Only 3% of pets were obtained from a rescue or shelter in our most marginalized and vulnerable household. So that is the definition of unidirectional flow. The vast majority of animals are coming in from these areas, and a minority of animals are going back. Why is that? Some things are just like lack of access to spay and neuter, mean that there's more unwanted or unmanageable litters born in our most marginalized communities until we solve that problem and make spay neuter affordable and accessible to everybody. But some of it is a lack of access to animal shelters to participate in the animal shelter system and be able to adopt as easily as somebody who has more privilege. So let's think about how could we change that? We don't have to wipe it out overnight, but there's lots of little tools that we might be able to use just to shift the uphill and downhill of our liquid dynamics, right? So that it's easier for animals to flow into communities that have historically been excluded from adoption and reclaim. So I thought we would try a thought exercise. There are things in life that are on our bucket list, or like we kind of want to do, or we know we really should do, or we know eventually we're going to have to do. But we don't do them. We don't do them for some reason. So here are a few from our team or from my own life of like, I know I need to update. I have got notifications that my passwords have been compromised, and I should update my passwords and like properly use a password manager. But I haven't done it yet. Or I have some insurance claims that I need to submit, but I haven't done that yet either. So these are some things, and I would love to see in the chat, like, do you have anything like this? You want to do it, you want to learn salsa dancing, or you should do it, you know. What do you have that's in your life that's like that? Just curious. Are we the only ones? Yes. This is so good. Fix a running toilet. Get a library card. Fix a vintage camper so we can travel around the US with our dogs. How about a few more? Tattoo, dye hair. Watch all of Dr. Hurley's webinars. It's because I'm too long-winded, right? Time is such a barrier. These are so great. Right? It's like zero-scape the yard, repair my drip system, so many things, clean the closet, start composting, train my dog. Dentist is such a common one. Poor dentists. Now, we're going to try a little exercise of how we could fix this. Have y'all done jam boards? We're going to do a jam board. Okay? Get ready, because it's going to be in the chat. I'm going to drop the link in the chat. And our challenge is to come up with as many reasons as we can why we don't do these things. Because We can then think of all the reasons why maybe someone wouldn't come to the shelter to adopt or reclaim their pet. But don't try and put it there yet. Let's just try and come up with a really huge list of all the possible barriers to doing things we want to do. We have to do. We're going to do them eventually. Why haven't we done them yet? Okay, so you don't know how to use a Jamboard. You can see me sharing my screen. You click on the sticky note and then type it in. Why haven't I used updated my password? Not sure. Process. No time. Don't want to get up any earlier, so it's like too daunting. How many of you have this? If I have to pick up the phone, if I can't do a live chat or email, it might not happen. Don't plan in advance. Yeah, it takes planning. This is the barrier of watching Netflix. The barrier of it's not more interesting or easier than Netflix, right? Netflix has done a brilliant job of removing all barriers to watching it. You don't even have to click I would like to watch the next show. In fact, you actively have to extract yourself from watching the next show. Embarrassment. Don't know how. Decision fatigue. Yeah, that's what it is for me. And the roofer, I'm just I can't decide. I don't know how to decide. All right, this Jamboard is going to stay open, but just afraid. That's a really good one. Afraid to discover the problem is worse than you think it is. Ashamed that you haven't gotten to it already. Yeah. And interesting what's not here too, that might speak to what, nobody has put language barrier. Maybe that's because we're largely, this is a webinar in English and we're largely a crowd that speaks the predominant language in our culture, but we know that, that when I want to order at my very favorite Chinese restaurant, they're seriously Chinese and I have to get my Chinese speaking friend to order it for me. So thinking about what are the barriers that are really common? What are the barriers that might be specific to someone who doesn't have a car or doesn't speak a language or has some kind of disability, visual differences or processing differences. So fantastic. So just to say, as a sort of encouragement, sometimes in shelters, there are some processes, some barriers that we don't have a lot of control over, or some barriers that we tend to focus on a lot, like cost. And that's a huge one, and it's really important. But for some shelters, you don't have always the authority to waive fees or eliminate fees. It's just inevitable. The shelter is out in a kind of hard to get to location. And so, you might have to do some work to find some offsite locations to be able to get animals where they're more convenient in terms of place. But what are some barriers, and just in terms of making the website more navigable, making language more accessible, making appointments more available? What are other barriers? You don't have to eliminate all the barriers. You just have to make the barriers lower than doing something else. Make the barriers lower than getting a pet from a pet store. Make the barriers lower than getting a new dog instead of getting the dog you already had back. So we want to be really expansive in our view of what barriers we can possibly tackle. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Karsten for part 2 of Barrier-orama.
Thanks, Kate. Just quick, while I'm getting set up, would you like to answer Sarah's question that's in the chat or in the Q&A?
Thank you, Dr. Karsten. Yes, that's what I was hoping. Kate, I'll read it to you. Is the definition of vulnerability or vulnerable solely based on household income in the area?
It is not based solely on household income. And while we are, there are several different social vulnerability indexes that can be used. And while Dr. Karsten is talking, I will go find the definitions that were used in those two different studies, because one was best friends and one was a research study out of Canada.
Okay. Hello, everybody. Thanks for being here today. So Kate did a great job of setting this up for what our barriers are resulting in. And so now we wanted to talk about the internal barriers that sometimes we do. And a lot of it comes from this very deep-rooted urge to try as we might to control everything. That is what we want to do. And we have to recognize that we don't have control over a lot of things. In fact, we don't have control over most things. We cannot, for example, really ever truly predict every situation that an animal or a person will find themselves in. And even though we try and we place restrictions either on the animal or on the person, it doesn't change that fact that we can't predict, we cannot control, and that it doesn't even usually even improve our ability to support people. We do know, like we all talk about it, well, past behavior predicts future behavior, but the really important part to consider about that is that only if it's in the same context. So some examples that we're all probably very familiar with and probably have tried ourselves would be things like no kids under a certain age, you got to have a fenced yard, you got to be home this many hours a day, or the owner needs to pay this much money to either adopt or get their pet back, or they have to spay or neuter before they can have their pet back. So barriers that we use in this very honest and deep effort to try to keep bad things from happening. And then we have other barriers of things simply not happening in a timely manner. We have animals waiting for something. So they hit this barrier, say for surgery or a place on the adoption floor. They're waiting for there to be fewer animals to compete with for their chance at adoption. So barriers that are standing between where they are now and where we want or we need them to be. And we all experience that this usually results from this mismatch of what needs to get done and the resources that we have available to do it. And the more barriers that are there, be it the ones we put on animals, that we put on people, or that are seemingly situational, they will result in a longer length of stay. They will increase the risk that folks will obtain pets from other sources, and animals are risk missing out on a really great home or getting to their right outcome. So I really hope for all of you that Ted Lasso has found his way into your life. And if he hasn't, then I would encourage you all to discover the barrier that is keeping him from you. And my very favorite scene in the 2 seasons is actually from the first season, where Ted, who is a college football coach, now turned soccer coach, is playing darts against Rupert, an extremely wealthy, seemingly powerful individual who actually owns the soccer team that Ted is coaching. So they're playing darts and there's a wager, and it's a really big wager, and you can see the crowd being really nervous for Ted in taking this wager. And towards the end of the game, of course, Ted is down, and he starts to tell a story, right? Right now, though, in the game, Ted is faced with this like impossible number combination of what he needs to win the game. So as he's about to go make his final play in this dart game that he is losing, he starts to tell a story of one day when he drove his son to school and he saw a sign, and on the sign was this quote from Walt Whitman: "Be curious, not judgmental." And he thinks about this quote, and in that he recognizes that people have always underestimated him as a man his whole life. Just as Rupert had underestimated Ted's ability to play darts. But if Rupert had been curious instead of judgmental, he would have known that Ted, in fact, played darts every single Sunday with his dad from the time he was aged 12 to 16 when his dad passed away. So Ted was an expert at darts, and Ted won that game, and Ted won that bet. And that is a powerful message, a message that has stood with me. Because we cannot control and stop bad things from happening. But we can treat everyone and every animal as an individual. We can be curious and we can respect that people know what is best for them and their situation. And then have our curiosity about what they need to feel supported in their decision. Share what you know, let people decide, and then be there to support them. And I think about how I like to be treated and how I react in different situations and the approach that's taken in those situations. And I know that I am going to be much more engaged. I'm going to feel much more welcome when I feel seen. When what I know, what I do, what I bring is at least asked about, that there's some curiosity. And that I may not know everything. In fact, almost certainly I don't know everything. I know something. And I at least bring some life experience. And that feeling that others are curious about that and acknowledge it, it's definitely going to improve my engagement and my willingness to learn and discuss. So how can we find out who people are, what they know, what they do, what their experiences are that they bring to us? And through their work with us, even if it's only one interaction. I was really not surprised and quite delighted to see this on the barriers board. It's a huge barrier that we all face, and I don't know that we always recognize it as a barrier, and that's decision fatigue. It's big and it is real, and it has nothing to do with our knowledge, with our education, or some sort of moral failing on our part. It's biology. It's how our quirky minds work. And it is a factor that will influence every single decision that you make. Decision fatigue, it will increase as you have more decisions to make. It'll increase with the cost of that decision, be it time, be it money, be it an emotional price. And it really increases when decisions are made in an environment of scarcity. And if each decision feels like it has a higher toll, right? Like if I don't do this right, like the cost of it is just because I don't have much. And then also recognizing that decision fatigue is increased when we're just generally fatigued. I know we've all felt it. And so if you're ever wondering why, say, your loving partner, in their attempt to show how much they care, asks what you would like for dinner, and your response is, I don't care. And we really bite their heads off, because really the most caring thing they could do in that moment is to not give you yet another decision, but to just go ahead and make the call. Because by that time we are done. The thought of another decision is like, phew. It's actually why Barack Obama always wore the same style of outfit because he didn't want to decide. Like, I'm not wasting my decision energy on what to wear. Yeah, that's why I love wearing scrubs too. Taking away that need to decide, right? Save our energy for the important decisions. And we know that tired and decision fatigue decision makers, we tend to just sort of make this default choice or stick with the status quo. And that makes sense, right? Stick with what you know, with what's familiar. And honestly, in a lot of situations, when we're fatigued, what happens is we choose not to choose. We just don't make a decision. We wait and we hope. We hope that something different will happen tomorrow, something better is on the horizon, maybe the next day or the next day or the next day. Or subconsciously, we wait and we see who gets sick. Makes our decision feel easier instead of being active about it and really trying to balance the needs of the animal with the realities of our organization and our situation. And this kind of default decision making, it is not moral failing. It is not weakness. It's the way our minds, or maybe the failure of our minds to work when we suffer from decision fatigue. So we have to be aware of it and we have to actively counteract it. So as you start to do that, I want you to think about this analogy, because I don't think we give ourselves this enough, is to recognize that energy doesn't equal time, right? Like, we may work an 8-hour day. Okay, let's be honest, a 10, 11-hour day. So we know we have this much time, but recognizing that, like, you can't have energy, the same energy level throughout the day. And certain things you do are going to take more energy. They may not take more time, but they may take more energy. So think about that as you're planning your day. When do you have the most energy, right? It's like your cell phone. If you just do things like texting or actually making a phone call, did y'all know your phones actually do that? They do make phone calls. Your battery life will last much longer than, say, if you stream movies, or if you try to use your phone to figure out where the heck you are and where the heck you're going, right? We're the same way. We will exhaust our batteries much faster, with some of the things that we have to do. So know that about yourself. And, a good place to start is never make an important decision on an empty stomach. Okay. Like, start there and I know I have much more energy at the beginning of the day. I am a morning person. It drives some people crazy, but it is the honest truth. So I put things that need more energy, that need my attention at the beginning of the day. So simple things to get started, and just think about this. Think about your energy and what you do to conserve it, to refuel it, and that there is a limitation to it. And it's not just about the time that you have. Okay, so how do we counteract decision fatigue? Well, we build it into an effective system. We've got to have systems, and we got to do it ahead of time. We do it as a team with input from people impacted by the decisions, those who have knowledge. Because we know that everyone coming to us, they're not just a number, right? They are a unique individual, animal and person with unique needs, a different level of need, to get them the care they need and to the right outcome. So we need to get them on a pathway right away that meets their needs and is matched to what we have, what we're able to do. So one way to do this is having pathways, and maybe your pathways have levels, right? Like, maybe it's not a pathway to a certain outcome, but it's a level 1, a level 2, and a level 3. Easy, a little bit more from us, needing a lot more from us. And so everyone will get the basic needs met. Everyone gets the basic coping care package when they come into the shelter. They get bedding, they get a hiding spot, they get a double-sided compartment. Everyone gets that. Level 1s don't need much else, so we're not going to give them much else, right? We see this in this animal, they're tagged as a level 1, boom, you get this. I don't have to decide, I know what I see, boom, off you go. Level 2 needs a little medical, needs a little, little more help coping with their fear and anxiety. I'm definitely a level 2er. Boom, we see this, they get this. I don't have to think about it. I saw this, boom, level 2, off you go. 3, same thing, a little bit more. I see this, you get this, boom, and you move. Now, a level 2 can become, or a level 1, a cute puppy, say, easy, keep it fed. Breaks with parvo on the second day. Not our fault, unfortunate. Now it moves to a level 3. Okay, but we know that because we're keeping track, right? We've made our decisions. We know we see this, boom, you get this, and off you go. It's also a way to watch our capacity. Our pathways can have points. What is our point capacity? That everyone is aware of, we know where we are, because it's not just a number, right? They all need something from us. So it's a way to keep track of what we're doing, what we have available now, what we're using, what we have in our reserves. And decisions have been made, so we're not just new animal. Now we have to start over at the beginning and start making our decisions. No, they're in our system that we have built to support us. So when something happens outside of that system, we have the energy to make our decisions. Because guys, we have to make decisions. Because when we don't, we find ourselves left with only bad choices. Like, how often is it that you can find yourself in a dilemma of 2 not good choices? Or we get really frustrated with our staff. You're like, how does this person continually to make bad choices? And then we go back and look and like, wow, they didn't have a good decision to make. Like, they couldn't have won this. It was stacked against them from the beginning. So we need to find a way, at least most of the time, to have a default choice that's good, or at least good enough. And know when we're starting to approach a place where like, whoa, I'm getting to the point where I don't have any good decisions. So recognize this. Recognize that no good choice is a barrier to us making decisions, and then work towards being in a place where we always have a good choice to make. But in the meantime, at least give yourself the gratitude to choose the least worst of the 2 bad choices. And just a couple of red flags to figure out like, whoa, am I having some decision fatigue? Is this me? Just some things to look for. Your length of stay, especially to the outcome of euthanasia, right? If that is the right outcome for that animal, which we know it is for some, kindest thing we can do, then it needs to happen quickly for everyone's sake, for everyone's welfare, right? Are we finding that like, wow, we seem to not have good outcomes, but it's because animals have shelter acquired illness or behavior? Are we seeing maybe a bit more disease than we have in the past because they're here, right? Is something slowing them down? And just keeping an eye on your diet and care. I know we're approaching kitten season. That's a bit of an exception, but just something to keep an eye on that maybe we're not giving ourselves the ability to make decisions. All right, and then just to really think about the importance of trust and where the role trust plays in decision making. Trust in ourselves, trust in our community, trust with our coworkers, and vice versa. Folks having trust in us as leaders. We work so hard on communication, and that is critical. It's crucial. But it can feel like no one's listening, right? But think about it. Who do you trust? Why do you trust them? How was that trust built, and what does that trust allow you the privilege to do? Right? Like a lot of times we feel like we're getting pushback, but could that be an expression of mistrust? Because we also know that resistance can be a lack of clarity, but could it also involve some mistrust? Like, for example, reliability. Doing what you say you're going to do. Now, you personally may not have been the person or the organization who has let someone down by not doing what you're saying you're going to do. But if that is someone's lived experience, especially over and over, that people have said they're going to do things and they don't, trust is going to be difficult, if not impossible. So asking a lot of people to just take what we say at face value, that could be really difficult for people. But when people experience that our actions match our words, that we do what we say we're going to do, then bit by bit we start to build trust. So how can we be in a place where we can always do what we say we're going to do? What barriers can we remove to allow us to always do that? And of course, I did what one does when you're thinking about trust. You Google Brene Brown. And I came across this YouTube video. I have the link for it down in the corner. And it's just 10 minutes of Brene presenting at what I can only assume is a conference. And Oprah, the big O, is in the audience. And she talks about the anatomy of trust. And she breaks it down into the word of braving. And I think it's a really good listen. I would hope that you all can find 10 minutes of your day today or soon, especially if you feel like you're having trouble with decisions and feeling like you're not being trusted, because that's exhausting. And it's not sustainable to be in an environment where we're always second guessing ourselves or others, or that we're always being second guessed by those around us. So super good listen. Yeah, if someone could put that link in the chat for me, that would be super helpful. Sorry, didn't think to do that. And then as a nice reminder, I really liked this, was a resource provided to me by Rachel Finney about how not to fail in our decision makings and trust building. Just things to keep in mind of doing these things will cause us to fail. So work to not do them. And finally, be kind. Be kind to yourself and be kind to others as we look at what we're able to do in terms of removing barriers and facing those barriers regarding outcomes. And that it can be a difficult process, right? Both within our organization, between organizations, and that the trouble sometimes we witness in ourselves and in others of decision fatigue. Again, it's no one's fault. It's how we work, but we can counteract it. So we need to build that framework so we have a system that allows us to remain resilient and avoid exhaustion that tends to manifest itself as criticism of ourselves, of our team, of our performance, of our well-being. So take care of yourself in this process and of each other. And remember that being courageous and thoughtful and compassionate and timely in our decision making will allow us to help more people and animals and better protect the welfare of each of them and each of us. Because folks, we got a big end game, right? To get to our right outcome, that we can start to counteract that devastation that we have all felt when we've lost a pet. That's just the sheer loss. We can heal some of that and we can stabilize our systems. So when thinking about this, right, again, we don't have to remove every single barrier, but we just have to remove enough to get to the outcome, the right outcome that we want, and away from the ones that we don't. So now is the time to think about, we're going to Jamboard again. What barrier will you remove to help get animals to the right outcome?
And remember, that could be internal, could be external,
Could be both. Boom.
Beautiful.
All right, folks, what is one barrier? Get them in there.
And remember, if you need any hints, you can always scroll to the previous frame of all the barriers that have been barriers for you.
This arrow.
For some of us.
Yeah, this arrow at the top takes you back to the previous Jamboard. But I'm going to keep us here.
Aw.
Sorry, we're watching. Guys, these are great. Brene, I borrow from Brene frequently. One final thing for everyone today. Take it away, Mandy.
June is Removing Barriers Month. If it is not sparking joy, if it is separating pets from people, if it's not advancing your mission, let's throw it out. Let's everybody head to Maddie's Pet Forum. I'm going to drop the link right here in the month of June and post a barrier that wasn't helping anymore and you're ready to be done with. And we are going to choose 3 winners in the end of June to draw a prize from the Basket of Joy, which is filled with joy. We have the Best Practice Playbook by none other than Dr. Sarah Paisano. We have Yetis. Who doesn't need coffee during kitty season? All the sizes. Kitten season, 20 ounces, 26, 36 chug cap. If you need extra water or coffee, thank you, Karsten, for showcasing. And my favorite, our own team musician, Andy Poet, will make you or your shelter a jingle. Not a giant one, but a nice little fun jingle, personalized. Can be your ringtone, can be your doorbell. You can play it before you enter rooms. You can put it on your website. Personalized jingle just for you. 3 winners. Everybody gets to pick, but we only have 1 jingle. But the rest we have more than one. Put them in there. We're not going to pick based on barrier. Your barrier is personal to you. We're going to put everybody's name in a hat and draw. So it's completely at random, just post. If for any reason you can't find it, you're not alone. Don't let that be a barrier to playing. Just email us at info@maddiesmillionpetchallenge.org. We've so enjoyed spending Tuesdays with everybody. If there is a webinar that you'd like to see or a series, please give us a shout. And we always want to know what you want to hear about. In the meantime, thank you for joining us.
Go forth, remove barriers.
Thank you all so much.
Thank
for
you,
being
guys.
here. Remember, it could be a tiny little barrier. Get it in there and get a chance at your Yeti prize pack.